one of the deans of the city now, and certainly he is dean of the theological school at Howard University. He has done a great deal of research in the field. I can hardly begin to tell you about his work. That is Dean Lawrence Jones. He did his undergraduate work at West Virginia State College, and he went on there from West Virginia State to Oberlin, and from Oberlin to Yale, doing his theological work. And then I think that I introduce you to one who is well known in this city, born in Washington, D.C., the Reverend David Eaton, who is the senior pastor of the Unitarian Church here, All Souls Unitarian Church. He did his undergraduate work at Howard University, so he has come in contact with a number of the people that you've heard speaking today. He did his graduate work at Boston University School of Theology. And I can say to you that we're not talking today from an ivory tower. We're talking with men who have had some real experience with the church. I think I was selected to moderate this problem issue session because I am what they call a PK, a preacher's kid. And I've lived through the whole thing, you know. And it is sort of an irony that I think that in America, the blacks, or as some people on our panel did not like us calling us black, they wanted us to say Negro. Whatever you feel comfortable with is all right with me. I would say, however, that as you think about the blacks, we have both benefited from and been victims of the kind of prejudices that have come up from segregation in this community and in the shadow of the Capitol. For example, I would say at the beginning that there were certain kinds of consequences that came through, and I will cite one very simple one that started off in the discussion yesterday. You know, the wonderful black minds, all that were channeled into the fields of teaching, primary, secondary, and higher education, because that was the only place for them to go at that period of time. So they would channel into that. But the real plus that came from it was that we had such wonderful teachers. Absolutely the cream of the crop. And so that out of that problem, there were some things that happened to us because of the kind of people that were made available to the black youth in this city. They were educated, and they became tough-minded. Somehow I took a little offense to an article that came out this morning that talked about the privileged blacks who were sort of off on the side and having a special kind of privilege. I can tell you from my own personal experience that really we learned a great deal, and we knew that we were living in a segregated society. We weren't dumb. We knew we were living in a segregated society. But we also were taught how you challenge that system. And we were taught this by the kind of people who were our role models, who were our motivators, and who worked with us. We knew that a black segregated school was saying something loud and clear, and that they were saying that you were in the position of inferiority, so we will send you to a separate school. We see it in South Africa today. We see it all over the world, and we see the subtleties of that. So let us not forget to face up to it. But we also knew in that kind of period that we had something that was very important. It was a challenge. It was a challenge to our parents. It was a challenge to our teachers, who spent enormous amount of time helping us and working with us, because they wanted us to be able to contend with the barriers that were intentional, like putting you off somewhere separately, as well as the unintentional barriers that result from that kind of thing. And so, as I was thinking about coming here today, I could just recite so many marvelous mentors in this community, people who have just been wonderful to me personally. And I am one of the few people in this room that has lived in the same house all of these years of my life. I can't even begin to tell you, and I won't tell you my age. But, I began to think about Howard Thurman, because he passed on Friday. And Howard Thurman was a marvelous mentor to both me and to my husband. He was one of the 3 ministers that helped to see that I was solidly married. And he was such a wonderful person in terms of being able to sit down and think through your problems. And he wrote something that I found this morning in a book that was called Racial Roots and Religion. It's a beautiful book. And he said something about his grandmother talked to him, and he and his sister used to sit there very quietly, because they knew, as they knew all ministers did in that day, they were going to end with the same thing. And the same thing that his grandmother always ended with in him was, you are not slaves. You are God's children. When grandmother said this, she would stand back high, said Howard, and she would look you straight in the eye, and somehow she grew taller when she said that. And it was so much a important guide in his life that he said he did not need a racial revolution to give him dignity. He had dignity. He did not need to wait for that revolution to come for that. He said that meant that there was nothing that could happen to me, nothing in my environment that would ever touch this dignity and this self-worth that my grandmother gave to me. It gave me my dignity, and I think that is everything that I ever felt, I worked for, and believed in, was founded in a kind of private sort of thing, and I got private autonomy. I really knew myself and what was in me. And this is the kind of thing he said I try to pass on to my children. We have to keep them from internalizing our environment in terms of its negative judgment, so that when you walk into a room, nobody can tell you that you are not a unique human being and that you are not as good as anybody else in there. Of course, our talents are all different, but all of us have a kind of uniqueness. And I would say to you that if we leave nothing with you when you internalize, do not be captured by this negativism. Thurman was a whole man. Can we do this for the whole generation of youth? Can we make them whole? I believe in it. Every experience in my educational career, every experience in my spiritual life has deepened that kind of belief. I think you have 3 discussants who are going to be able to do that this afternoon. The Reverend Pruitt.
After Dr. Washington is finished, is there really anything else to say?
Oh, come down.
I think my role today is 2-pronged, to talk about the origins of the black church and to say just a bit about Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is probably the oldest black church in this city. Let me take just half of the time allotted for me, so that I might leave the rest for my more erudite brethren, who will probably discuss at great length those subjects before them. Most of you are familiar with the major black denominations, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is the oldest, and I say that with a great deal of pride because I happen to be a member of that denomination myself, and the first indigenous denomination born on American soil, the African Methodist Episcopal Church Zion under Bishop Varick, the CME Church, which is now the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, but in its formative days was the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, and of course the great Baptist Church with all of its variations, and the Pentecostal churches. I think most of them, except for the Pentecostal churches, were born in the 1700s or the early 1800s, and they were born simply, except for the CME Church, which happened to be a ward of the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Methodist Church South particularly, said we don't want these emotional blacks in our houses of worship, and so they established other houses of worship and called them Colored Methodist Episcopal so that they could worship under their own vine and fig tree. Richard Allen, Bishop Varick of the AME Zion Church, both began in Philadelphia, and as you know, Absalom Jones started the first black Episcopal church in Philadelphia. All of them contemporaries. Varick went into New York, where Mother Zion, which is the AME Zion's first church now is, and Mother Bethel in Philadelphia, started by Richard Allen, but all of it was a protest against segregation. It's the strange thing about Christianity, and particularly white Christianity in this country. They served the same God. They believed theologically the same things, that out of one blood God made all mankind except for black blood. That had to be in a separate category altogether. And Dr. Charles Drew of this city proved that through his blood plasma techniques that there is no black blood or blue blood or green blood, but indeed God did make man out of one blood. Now the early church, the early black church, why was it necessary? What was its function? Of course, to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, and some overdid that, because that's all some of them talked about. I said to Dean Jones just before coming in that I was in a church very recently where they were talking about the blood of Christ to such an extent that I just felt as though I'd had a blood transfusion before I left that building. But the early fathers of the religion, the early fathers of the faith, the pioneers of the faith, were sensitive to their responsibility, not only to God, but to man. And so Richard Allen and Varick and Lot Carey, who took the Baptist church into Liberia and into West Africa, even though they traveled separate roads, they knew that all of them eventually led to Rome. They talked about social salvation. They talked about man's redemption not only in terms of spirituality, but in terms of economics. They knew that in order for a man to truly serve God, his stomach had to be filled. His mind had to be trained. And if he were to be a new creation, it would have to be a total work of redemption and not isolated only to the spiritual realm. Out of the black church came in the 60s, for instance, the Cleavers, the Malcolm X's, the Foremans, name all of the revolutionaries who came out of the 60s to do battle. Do you know most of them were ministers' sons? When the black church had started again to slip into its heavenly vision rather than understanding its earthly mission as well, these young men became discontented and restless with that kind of theology and set out to change mankind's points of view and hopefully their destiny through other organizational strengths. Well, let me simply say, and I conclude after giving you a microscopic view of the black church, that its primary function was to lift men from slavery to freedom, from nothing to something, from indignity to pride, from its dark past to the new shining light of black America, and to say to men in this country that if indeed it is a pluralistic society, then the sons and daughters from the soil of Africa must be respected as much as the sons and daughters from Ireland or from Germany. For indeed we discovered it is not a melting pot, it is just one big stew. Thank you very much.
I told you what you're going to get, didn't I? And now we're going to have the Reverend David Eaton, who is going to concentrate a little bit on the interracial church and the civil rights movement.
Excuse me, if I'm coming through okay. I had to smile because the word interracial and integrated are terms that I do not use. Just like I try to synthesize black and Negro and call us Afro-Americans. I think the word integrated has the connotation that you're pouring cream into coffee and it comes out extremely light because you use the whole gallon of cream to a cup of coffee. One of the reasons I went to All Souls Church in 1969 was because that I felt that if the message of Jesus of Nazareth had any real significance, that he, like Jeremiah, was talking about a religious community that has no barriers as to race or culture. Many of us know in history that the Apostle Paul concentrated on the Gentile community because as a Jew he felt that the message of Jesus of Nazareth was in fact a universal message. I reject the word integrated and I substitute the word pluralistic. Pluralistic means that you maintain your cultural identity, that you maintain your heritage, and you become cosmopolitan in a religious sense. It's a choice. If you care as a person from a particular race or culture to practice and to appreciate your culture and learn from other cultures as you grow spiritually and intellectually, then I think the Unitarian Church, especially here in Washington, All Souls Church, is the place that you can find this type of freedom. So the word integrated to me I reject. In most integrated situations, the power remains historically with whites. I'd like to say something else about that. The fact is, and Brother Pruitt and Brother Jones and Sister Washington can attest to this, there has never been a church in the United States that was black that non-blacks could not attend. This was even true in the Deep South. My grandfather was a Baptist preacher, and Pruitt doesn't know this, in New Iberia, Louisiana. And when I was a boy of 12 or 13 years of age, there were two white families that would break the law of the state of Louisiana and sneak into that church and participate in worship with the 60 or 70 black folks that were congregants of my grandfather, whose name was David H. Eaton, and I'm the second. When I was at Asbury Methodist Church in my boyhood and grew up in Asbury Methodist Church, many times whites would mistakenly come to that beautiful edifice on 11th and K Street, just knowing it was a white church. These were visitors to Washington. And they didn't realize that they were in a black church until they had gotten escorted down the aisles and were sitting down. And some actually got up and left, but some stayed and perspired. And being an altar boy at Asbury Methodist Church, I used to see this and smile. One day, I decided to go a few blocks away, and those of you who know Washington, to another Methodist church that I found out was a Methodist just like ours, and I was stopped at the door, told by the white usher that our church was down the street. And he pointed where it was, and I said, yes, I know that church. I just came from that church to find out what this church was doing. And now I know what this church is doing, and I am very comfortable down the street if this is what you're doing. So I think the word integrated needs to be seen in a deeper significance. because the only institutions in American society that have always been open to all people, even in places where by law they ought not be open, have been black-controlled institutions, especially the black church. The Unitarian Church began in New England in the 18th century as a direct result in many ways, not just a theological debate as to the unity of God as opposed to the Trinity of God, but as Brother Jones may want to bring out, in some ways the Unitarian Church began because it was the abolitionist church that was the abolitionist branch of the Congregationalist Church in New England. So the split in the Congregationalist Church was not just among Trinitarian Christians and Unitarian Christians, which gave the birth to the Unitarian Church in North America, but that split was definitely had a lot to do with social action programs. And the whites and blacks in the Congregationalist Church, I would say, conservatively speaking, 75 to 80% that supported the abolitionist movements found themselves as Unitarian Christians. Reverend Parker, one of his famous sermons in Boston had to do with the Slave Act that required that Northerners return slaves that had escaped to the South. Who remembers that? The Fugitive Slave Act. And the great debate that was held in the churches of that time, almost 100% Christian Unitarians believed in breaking that unjust law, and they were led by Dr. Parker of Boston in that effort. The civil rights movement has not been new to the Unitarian Church. When one speaks of integrated churches prior to the dissolvement of the central jurisdiction in what is now the United Methodist Church, there were no integrated churches in the United States except for a few Roman Catholic churches, the Congregationalist Church in the north, Howard Thurman's church in San Francisco, and the Unitarian Church throughout the United States. There have been ministers in the South who were Unitarian ministers who were taken to jail or at least locked up because they allowed, in fact, blacks to visit their churches. This was in Atlanta and many places in Alabama. So I'd just like to say that when one speaks of integration and separatism, there are some other terms. One can say monolithic and pluralistic. I see the best type of church as being a pluralistic church, a church where persons from all races and cultures can, with their cultural and racial dignity, participate together, as it were, in a smorgasbord. We actually have instances as All Souls Church when the Jubilee Choir is singing, it seems as though that the black attendance is up and the white attendance is down. And when we go to Mozart and Beethoven, the white attendance is up and the black attendance is down. And when we do both, we have a great congregation. And I think we should make that clear that persons dealing with the civil rights movement came from all various backgrounds. Many ministers of churches in the South had to leave their pulpits because they followed the lead of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. One of the things I would like to touch on and let the panel continue, because I like to have points from discussion also. I am a legitimate product and feel proud of being a legitimate product of the Afro-American church. The only integrated experience, or the first integrated experience I had in my life, was when I went into the United States Army in 1954 upon graduation from Howard University. The public school system in this city and Howard University prepared me well for what was to come, which carried me to Boston University, Harvard, and a stint at Oxford. I would like to say that because of that early experience of persons, many of whom were right here in this room today, I think pluralism is a much better path. It is where we learn from other cultures, but maintain and remain culturally identified as Afro-Americans and recognize the beauty of our heritage. The word integrated churches, I don't think, can accomplish this, but I think pluralistic churches can accomplish this, and I want the viewers to know in all conclusiveness that to my knowledge there's never been a black church in this country that did not have its doors open to all people, and that I have experienced as a member of the black church.
And our final participant is a fantastic researcher. He's had ministerial experience. His background, he just sits up here and tells us the history and the dates as we discuss things. He knows them so well. I would tell you that he is going to talk to you about the black theological education, and I am indeed proud to present to you at this time Dr. Lawrence Jones.
Thank you. I sometimes say that if a person ever wondered whether or not God looks down with favor upon the black churches and many black institutions, one only has to look at the level of preparation of the leadership of the black churches in the early days. Indeed, as a matter of fact, I think it's true that today, by conservative estimate, more than 70% of our pastors have not had formal theological education. Many of them have not had a college education. Some have not had high school education. But the black church stands as a remarkable achievement to their creativity, their imagination, their leadership quality, and their ability to make do oftentimes with very little. Nevertheless, the concern within the black community for and within the black churches for education has always been a paramount thing. In 1840s, the AME Church passed legislation saying that every AME church had to have a school associated with it. Now that in spite of the fact that some of the pastors hadn't been to third grade themselves. Booker T. Washington testified that during the period of the Reconstruction that the most widely used textbook and spelling book was the Bible, and the school was the church. In the period of the Reconstruction and the years following, the AME Church, for example, spent over $7 million. These were slaves, ex-slaves, who within a 10 or 20-year period gave over $7 million for purposes of education. The Baptist Church, for example, before 1900, had established over 80 schools and academies and small elementary schools. The AME Church about 40. Even the young CME Church by 1900 had established 8 schools and colleges. Virtually the first thing any church did was to establish a school. And you will know that it wouldn't be until about 1890 when the federal government got in the business of higher education. That's why so many of the schools in the South that today are called universities never really approach university status are called universities because the churches in their vision thought they would become universities. But the pattern of education among blacks has paralleled that of many white church-supported institutions. As the cost of education has increased and as the federal funds and state funds have become more available, churches have found it impossible to support those schools. Even so, today, there are very great numbers of church-related schools, and you know that their existence is being debated on 2 grounds. One, what is significant about being church-related, and 2, do we need black education? It's not necessary for us to enter into that debate here today. But it is fair to say that many of the great institutions that we look to were begun by churches and had as their specific purpose the training of black clergy. Virtually every school established in the South following Reconstruction. Matter of fact, there were only 3 institutions for blacks before the Civil War. That is, that looked to higher education. One was the Ashman Institute, which became Lincoln University, was supported by the Northern Presbyterian. The Union Seminary, which was started by the AMEs in Columbus, Ohio in 1840, and Wilberforce University, which was finally purchased by the AME Church from the Methodist Church in 1863. That in itself was a very major achievement. Wilberforce University was bought by Daniel Alexander Payne, who didn't have a cent in his pocket. He committed his own self personally for a note for $10,000 and purchased Wilberforce University. The theological education of blacks, therefore, in the earliest days was integrated into collegiate education. Virtually every school had a department of religion and made arrangements to have 2 levels in that department. Those for the persons who hadn't finished high school who wanted to be trained. That happened at Howard University. Incidentally, Howard University was begun in the living room of the First Congregational Church. And the theological department was the 3rd department begun there, even though at the outset that's what Howard University was established for. But education took place in these colleges and universities. It wouldn't be till the 1890s that you got theological seminaries in the formal sense. Howard University's Department of Religion, however, was organized in 1870. Now today, we only have in this country 5 schools that are committed to the theological education of blacks as their main purpose. 3 of these are fully accredited. 2 are not. Howard, Virginia Union, and the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta are the accredited schools. Payne Theological Seminary at Wilberforce and Hood Theological Seminary at Salisbury, Livingstone College, are the 2 that are not accredited. Nevertheless, it's my judgment that the times and the complexities of our society are going to require more and more that persons be educated. We've made a survey of the city of Washington, and we have found out that the churches that have been most active in civil rights and have been most active in the quest for social justice are all led by persons who are theologically trained. Now, by the same token, and I wouldn't want to derogate from that at all, many a person not theologically trained has been on the firing line in that matter too. So I'm not equating theological training with social sensitivity. I'm just suggesting that with the complexity of our society and the rising level of awareness of our people, that the simple, unadorned gospel of the blood is perhaps not going to be adequate. If we do not address that question, the silent hemorrhage, and I do think there's a silent hemorrhage going on in some black churches, is going to be exacerbated and accelerated. And many of them will be dead and won't even know it. So I, for one, would want to say that if you survey the history of our nation, you'll find that the leadership that has come from the church will in large measure have come from persons who have had some vision born of their education, either at collegiate or the theological education level.
Now,
You didn't even need a timekeeper.
I didn't need that timekeeper. They all felt it, and they stayed right on time to leave this part of it up to you. You have so much to think about, as we have discussed with these experts in the field, the church, and we now look forward to how we can build on the supportive services of the church in this period when we call high inflation. We are so determined about jobs because we have high unemployment. We have great discussions in the field of education about the incapability of black students because of a testing program that determines that you cannot bloom if you have not passed a certain level at the first grade, which all of us know is a bunch of baloney. But nevertheless, the church has got to move in terms of the family problems that we have. We no longer have the extended family where the grandmother could stand up and tell you what Howard Thurman's grandmother told him. We don't live together. We talk about the nuclear family. And then we talk about the solo parents in our society, growing every year. And the women who have become heads of households, they have to devote so much of their time just completely to either their skilled laboring jobs, which pay more than any others, or in terms of their professional work and their education and their capability, that we don't know what's going to happen with the children. We have the lack of the nursery schools where we can feel that our children are getting the appropriate kind of care. Now, all of these are the kinds of things that our supportive networks have developed through the church. We want you to share your ideas with us and to ask these experts the kind of questions about where we need to go now, today. I can't see out there. All right. The young lady is.
There are over 600 churches in Washington, 600, I think, 34. A number of these are small churches. As many as 80% of pastors not only pastor but also have other jobs. Many of them moonlight in order to pastor. The average size of churches, there are approximately 100,000 churches in America that are black. The average size is 200. The average size of the white church is 600. Now, there are reasons for that. And there are some of the things that Dr. Washington has referred to. Why do churches stay small, which virtually condemns them to social ineffectiveness? Well, because they're the only place where people have any name. They're the only place where they have dignity. It's the only place where they can exercise any leadership talents they have. Maybe they just wear a nurse's uniform, or maybe they're just an usher. So very often I think we overlook the social significance of the church for the person who goes there. I know a church in New York, for example, that has 10, 12,000 members, that has 100 clubs. It has a club for every state in the union. It is broken down so that in the small units, this need for recognition, this need for significance takes place. Now, by the same token, the fragmentation of the church, whatever its gospel, and I don't think that preaching the blood of Christ makes for social significance at all. Some of the most significant churches are those that have that particular understanding of what the work of Christ was. So I wouldn't equate that. But I think we have to understand the other than religious dimension of the church in an effort to understand our people. And I think very frequently, the folk who go to church, you go to some of the churches in the city. They start very early in the morning. They have great numbers of elderly people who come. That's the only time they get out. The only time they can eat together. They stay for afternoon service, then stay for evening service. It is the only respite they have from all the expenditure of energy that they do during the week. So I wouldn't think it's the theology of the church. I think the otherworldliness of the church has been overestimated, because the churches that early started in this country, Richard Allen's church. Richard Allen, I suppose, could talk about the blood of Christ with anybody. And yet his was a socially significant church. That's not the point. I think one of the points to make is our smallness, our fragmentation. We talk very often about the black church. There's no such creature. There are black churches. We do not in our, and I'm talking too long, I'll shut up. We do not in our community have a single black denomination that marshals the power that its membership would dictate. We do not have a single black church headquarters in this country that provides the resources that we ought to have from a black church headquarters. We don't have a single church that speaks with a single voice and that instructs its people on important issues. We don't have that. We're still a highly fragmented group. We have been bound to, I sometimes say the black community is more the result of pressure from the outside than it is from unity on the inside. Mm-hmm. We're sort of like somebody described the church. The church is like a ship in a storm. You couldn't stand the stench on the inside if it wasn't for the storm on the storm on the outside. And I sometimes think our communities are like that. So I wouldn't equate theological commitment to social relevance.
Yes.
I think I know what you're speaking about. Oftentimes it is perceived that as the black church, using the term black church as Brother Jones is using it, not a monolithic, but black churches, especially those of the Pentecostal and some Baptist orientation, have preached a type of condemnation gospel that persons who wanted to exercise some freedom felt that they had to leave the church in order to exercise it. I know, for an example, having spoken to young people in the South and other places where dancing in the church was prohibited, dancing was a sin, playing cards is a sin, and things of that nature. I think this is what you're speaking to, that there was sort of an equation set up that if you did these things, you had to leave the church to do them. And that certainly, as you're saying, has a sense of being oppressive. The other perception of oppressiveness, and I'm being very clear with words because I'm not dealing with the reality necessarily, but the perception of oppressiveness is that as the black church kept blacks together, kept them sane, kept blacks all through the period of slavery and during Reconstruction as a unit of persons who still had hope in the midst of almost a hopeless situation. Many interpret that to mean that the black church was not, quote-unquote, militant to come out and fight against oppression, that the black church was in some type of coalition with the power structure to keep blacks in their places. Now, this is also a perception. So I think you're speaking of those types of perceptions. I think to a certain degree, and this would take a seminar, that many of those perceptions are in fact valid. Now the degree of validity of those perceptions would be something for a seminar. I think it would differ in degree of validity based upon locale, based upon the type of church you were talking about, based upon many aspects of the states in which those churches were located. So your indication that the black church and the way that Dr. Jones uses the term has been oppressive to black people as well as liberating, I think that side of the equation does have some validity, but the validity would have to be decided in terms of historical incidents, the type of place, and what was happening. But those two areas, personal oppression in terms of don't do this, otherwise you have to leave the church if you do, and keeping one's sanity does have the instance of meaning stay in one's place. And so I think those comments are in fact valid.
Well, I think, we have to look at this. Yes.
A little more definitive, African Methodist.
I wanted to ask you a question. Growing out of something that Eaton said about Franklin Eaton. In my generation, a structured church, if you understand what I mean, was full of us having more power, nationally or regionally or whatnot, because of society elders. I don't know whether those terms were valid.
Yes, you're good at me. Go right on.
All right. Would you agree that there is no more, that there is a diminution of power from the Methodist Church today as opposed to 25, 30 years ago? Focusing on this forward progress of black people. Is there less power?
In the hierarchical church.
In the hierarchical church, as opposed to the